Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Adventure Mystery Book Club. I am Bill Mallory, branch manager of the La Jolla Library, um, and I'm so glad you could join me for today's reading of Captain Blood by Rafeal Sabatini. We are going to be reading Chapter 8, which is a relatively short chapter, and then so we'll throw in Chapter 9 also, which is of the standard size chapter. So we'll jump on that in just a moment, and hopefully you are reading along with your copy, or perhaps you have seen it on Project Gutenberg, and you have a copy that you are reading online. And I hope you are enjoying this as much as I am. Um, certainly a certainly a rousing pirate tale so far. In fact, um, the author seems to enjoy leaving us on cliffhangers. Um, our our protagonist, our hero, Peter Blood, um, is looking to escape the sugar plantation that he has been enslaved to in Barbados, and he has he really, I mean, they had this wonderful plan going, and he had people who had sailing experience. They were gonna buy a boat using the money from one of the other doctors who was giving him this money to get rid of him, basically. But they're willing to finance this venture secretly, so nobody knows. And they have even made the acquaintance of a man who was also in Barbados for crimes. In that Mr. Nuttall was there to as a debtor, and that was his crime. And he was going to buy them a boat, and he did. They gave him the money that the doctor had given him. Then, because Peter Blood, of course, has a certain amount of freedom to be able to come and go in his capacity as a physician. So he goes over to Mr. Nuttall, who's a bit of a nervous sort, but he gives him the money, instructs him what uh, boat to buy. He does, and now of course, they had the plan. They had this wonderful plan to kind of to have all the men in their group. They have gotten about a dozen men with sailing experience as members of the slave crew there, and they were going to escape, and so it was all going to work out perfectly right up until the time it didn't, because the first night Peter Blood was called unexpectedly to the governor's mansion where he was treating the governor for gout. It's apparently a very bad attack. He ends up staying the whole night, so that evening is done. And then the police start to come around, and they start to say, well, you didn't pay there's a certain fee that you have to pay whenever you purchase a boat, and you didn't pay that, and so you need to pay that, otherwise we're going to have to come and get you. And Mr. Nuttall is very nervous, and he ends up kind of making a mess of things because he goes to Colonel Bishop's plantation. He walks around. He makes kind of a nuisance of himself. People start asking the slavers there start asking, "What are you doing here? Oh, what are you doing? I can't believe you're here." And he finds Jeremy Pitt, who is working in the fields. And while he is there, Mr. Nuttall is explaining the problem here, is explaining that he needs extra money for this extra fee or whenever you buy a boat. And uh, Mr. Pitt is basically saying, I don't have any money. What are you asking me for? If you wanted to find Peter Blood, you're not going to find him in the sugarcane fields. You're going to find him working as a physician. What are you doing here? Mr. Nuttall isn't quite making the right connection. But of course, they get the attention of the owner of the plantation, Colonel Bishop, and Colonel Bishop and two of the other slaves who act as his bodyguard. Um, come in, and they see Mr. Nuttall run off into the woods, and it's like, what's going on here? And of course, Mr. Nuttall is basically doing everything wrong, everything that looks the most suspicious out of everything that he could possibly do. If he that the author says in the story, if he had just stayed in Peter Blood's hut and waited for him to come back, none of this would have happened, but it didn't. So um, Colonel Bishop wants to find out who was that person. Jeremy Pitt won't tell him, and so he is taken from the fields and he is whipped, and whipped to the point where his back is a bloody mess, which is unfortunate. They talk about how he's left out in the sun. He's still chained up, so he can't move. He can't go anywhere. He's just left in the sun with a bloody back, and the flies start coming in, and that's an additional sort of level of torture. And it's only at this stage that Peter Blood returns. Now, Peter Blood does his best to administer some remedy to Jeremy Pitt, and all the while this is going on, they have been watching this ship out in the harbor getting closer and closer, and it's got the Union Jack flying, and it's coming in, and it's not really sort of going very fast, so they're not really paying much attention to it. But Colonel Bishop then sees Peter Blood giving Jeremy Pitt water and covering his wounds from the flies, a palmetto leaf that is draped over his back. And of course, Colonel Bishop has to have it out with him and has to argue with him, and Peter Blood is just doesn't back down. He doesn't fight with him necessarily, but it doesn't back down either. And just as things are about to get to a head, the ship lands or docks in the harbor in Barbados and pull down their Union Jack, draw up a pirate flag, and it turns out they are being attacked by pirates. So that's where the author left us at the end of the last chapter, and that is where we will begin at the start of chapter 8. So very tense stuff going on here. Oh my goodness, what's going to happen next? Who can say? Well, the author will say, and I will read his words. Chapter 8 is entitled Spaniards. The stately ship that had been allowed to sail so leisurely into Carlisle Bay under her false colors was a Spanish privateer, coming to pay off some of the heavy debt piled up by the predacious brethren of the coast, and the recent defeat by the Pride of Devon of 2 treasure galleons bound for Cadiz. It happened that the galleon which escaped in a more or less crippled condition was commanded by Don Diego de Espinosa y Valdez, who was own brother to the Spanish Admiral Don Miguel de Espinosa, and who was also a very hasty, proud, and hot-tempered gentleman. Galled by his defeat, and choosing to forget that his own conduct had invited it, he had sworn to teach the English a sharp lesson which they should remember. He would take a leaf out of the book of Morgan and those of other robbers of the sea, and make a punitive raid upon an English settlement. Unfortunately for himself, and for many others, his brother, the admiral, was not at hand to restrain him when, for this purpose, he fitted out 5 llagos at San Juan de Puerto Rico. He chose for his objective the island of Barbados, whose natural strength was apt to render her defenders careless. He chose it also because thither had the Pride of Devon been tracked by his scouts, and he desired a measure of poetic justice to invest his vengeance. And he chose a moment when there were no ships of war at anchor in Carlisle Bay. He had succeeded so well in his intentions that he had aroused no suspicion until he saluted the fort at short range with a broadside of 20 guns. And now the 4 gaping watchers in the stockade on the headland beheld the great ship creep forward under the rising cloud of smoke, her mainsail unfurled to increase her steering way, and go about close-hauled to bring her larboard guns to bear upon the unready fort. With the crashing roar of that second broadside, Colonel Bishop awoke from stupefaction and to a recollection of where his duty lay. In the town below, drums were beating frantically, and a trumpet was bleating, as if the peril needed further advertising. As commander of the Barbados militia, the place of Colonel Bishop was at the head of his scanty troops, in that fort which the Spanish guns were pounding into rubble. Remembering it, he went off at the double, despite his bulk and the heat, his negroes trotting after him. Mr. Blood turned to Jeremy Pitt. He laughed grimly. "Now that," said he, "is what I call a timely interruption. Though what'll come of it," he added as an afterthought, "the devil himself knows." As a third broadside was thundering forth, he picked up the palmetto leaf and carefully replaced it on the back of his fellow slave. And then into the stockade, panting and sweating, came Kent, followed by the best part of a score of plantation workers, some of whom were black and all of whom were in a state of panic. He led them into the low white house to bring them forth again within a moment, as it seemed armed now with muskets and hangers, of some of them equipped with bandoliers. By this time the rebels convict were coming in twos and threes, having abandoned their work upon finding themselves unguarded and upon scenting the general dismay. Kent paused a moment as his hastily armed guard dashed forth to fling an order to the slaves. "To the woods," he bade them. "Take to the woods and lie close there until this is over, and we've gutted those Spanish swine." On that he went off in haste after his men, who were to be added to those massing in the town, so as to oppose and overwhelm the Spanish landing parties. The slaves would have obeyed him on the instant, but for Mr. Blood. "What need for haste, and in this heat?" quoth he. He was surprisingly cool, they thought. "Maybe there'll be no need to take to the woods at all, and, anyway, it will be time enough to do so when the Spaniards are masters of the town." And so, joined now by the other stragglers, and numbering in all a round score, rebels convict all, they stayed to watch from their vantage ground the fortunes of the furious battle that was being waged below. The landing was contested by the militia and by every islander capable of bearing arms, with the fierce resoluteness of men who knew that no quarter would be expected in defeat. The ruthlessness of the Spanish soldiery was a byword, and not at his worst had Morgan or Lolonaise ever perpetrated such horrors as those of which these Castilian gentlemen were capable. But this Spanish commander knew his business, which was more than could be truthfully said for the Barbados militia. Having gained the advantage of a surprise blow, which had put the fort out of action, he soon showed them that he was the master of the situation. His guns turned now upon the open space behind the mole, where the incompetent bishop had marshaled his men, tore the militia into bloody rags, and covered the landing parties which were making the shore on their own boats, and in several of those which had rashly gone out to the great ship before her identity was revealed. All through the scorching afternoon the battle went on, the rattle and crack of musketry penetrating ever deeper into the town, to show that the defenders were being driven steadily back. By sunset 250 Spaniards were masters of Bridgetown. The islanders were disarmed, and at the government house, Governor Steed, his gout forgotten in his panic, supported by Colonel Bishop and some lesser officers, was being informed by Don Diego that an urbanity that was itself a mockery of the sum that would be required in ransom. For 100,000 pieces of 8 and 50 head of cattle, Don Diego would forbear from reducing the place to ashes. And what time that suave and courtly commander was settling these details with the apoplectic British governor, the Spaniards were smashing and looting, feasting, drinking, and ravaging after the hideous manner of their kind. Mr. Blood, greatly daring, ventured down at dusk into the town. What he saw there is recorded by Jeremy Pitt, to whom he subsequently related it, in that voluminous log from which the greater part of my narrative is derived. I have no intention of repeating any of it here. It is all too loathsome and nauseating, incredible indeed that men, however abandoned, could ever descend such an abyss of bestial cruelty and lust. What he saw was, fetching him in haste and white-faced out of that hell again, when in a narrow street a girl hurtled into him, wild-eyed, her unbound hair streaming behind her as she ran. After her, laughing and cursing in a breath, came a heavy-booted Spaniard. Almost he was upon her, when suddenly Mr. Blood got in his way. The doctor had taken a sword from a dead man's side some little time before, and armed himself with it against an emergency. As the Spaniard checked in anger and surprise, he caught in the dusk the livid gleam of that sword which Mr. Blood had quickly unsheathed. "Ah, perro inglés!" he shouted, and flung forward to his death. "It's hoping I am you're in a fit state to meet your Maker," said Mr. Blood, and ran him through the body. He did the thing skillfully, with the combined skill of swordsman and surgeon. The man sank in a hideous heap without so much as a groan. Mr. Blood swung to the girl, who leaned panting and sobbing against a wall. He caught her by the wrist. "Come," he said. But she hung back, resisting him by her weight. "Who are you?" she demanded wildly. "Will you wait to see my credentials?" he snapped. Steps were clattering toward them from beyond the corner round which she had fled from that Spanish ruffian. "Come," he urged again, and this time, reassured perhaps by his clear English speech, she went without further questions. They sped down an alley and then up another, by great good fortune meeting no one, for already they were on the outskirts of the town. They won out of it, and white-faced, physically sick, Mr. Blood dragged her almost at a run up to the hill towards Colonel Bishop's house. He told her briefly who and what he was, and thereafter there was no conversation between them until they reached the big house. It was all in darkness, which at least was reassuring. If the Spaniards had reached it, there would be lights. He knocked, but had to knock again and yet again before he was answered. Then it was by a voice from a window above. "Who is there?" The voice was Miss Bishop's, a little tremulous, but unmistakably her own. Mr. Blood almost fainted in relief. He had been imagining the unimaginable. He had pictured her down in that hell out of which he had just come. He had conceived that she might have followed her uncle into Bridgetown, or committed some other imprudence, and he turned cold from head to foot at the mere thought of what might have happened to her. "It is I, Peter Blood," he gasped. "What do you want?" It is doubtful whether she would have come down to open, for at such a time as this, it was no more than likely that the wretched plantation slaves might be in revolt and prove as great a danger as the Spaniards. But at the sound of her voice, the girl Mr. Blood had rescued peered up through the gloom. "Arabella!" she called. "It is I, Mary Trail." "Mary!" The voice ceased above on that exclamation. The head was withdrawn. After a brief pause, the door gaped wide. Beyond it, in the wide hall, stood Miss Arabella, a slim, virginal figure in white, mysteriously revealed in the gleam of a single candle which she carried. Mr. Blood strode in, followed by his distraught companion, who, falling upon Arabella's slender bosom, surrendered herself to a passion of tears. But he wasted no time. "Whom have you here with you? What servants?" he demanded sharply. The only male was James, an old negro groom. "The very man," said Blood. "Bid him get out horses, then away with you to Spaystown, or even farther north where you will be safe. Here you are in danger, in dreadful danger." "But I thought the fighting was over," she was beginning, pale and startled. "So it is, but the deviltry's only beginning. Miss Trail will tell you as soon as you go. In God's name, madam, take my word for it, and do as I bid you." He saved me," sobbed Miss Trail. "Saved you?" Miss Bishop was aghast. "Saved you from what, Mary?" "Let that wait," snapped Mr. Blood almost angrily. "You've all night for chattering when you're out of this, and away beyond their reach. Will you please call James and do as I say, and at once?" "You are very peremptory." "Oh, my God, I am peremptory. Speak, Miss Trail. Tell her whether I've cause to be peremptory." "Yes, yes," the girl cried, shuddering. "Do as he says. Oh, for pity's sake, Arabella." Miss Bishop went off, leaving Mr. Blood and Miss Trail alone again. I shall never forget what you did, sir," said she, through her diminishing tears. She was a slight wisp of a girl, a child, no more. "I've done better things in my life. That's why I'm here," said Mr. Blood, whose mood seemed to be snappy. She didn't pretend to understand him, and she didn't make the attempt. Did you kill him?" she asked, fearfully. He stared at her in the flickering candlelight. "I hope so. It was very probable, and it doesn't matter at all," he said. "What matters is that this fellow James should fetch the horses." And he was stamping off to accelerate these preparations for departure when her voice arrested him. "Don't leave me! Don't leave me here alone!" she cried, in terror. He paused. He turned and came slowly back. Standing above her, he smiled upon her. "There, there. You've no cause for alarm. It's all over now. You'll be away soon, away to Spaystown, where you'll be quite safe." The horses came at last, 4 of them, for in addition to James, who was to act as her guide, Miss Bishop had her woman who was not to be left behind. Mr. Blood lifted the slight weight of Mary Trail to her horse, and then turned to say good-bye to Miss Bishop, who was already mounted. He said it, and seemed to have something to add, but whatever it was, it remained unspoken. The horses started, and receding into the sapphire starlit night, leaving him standing there before Colonel Bishop's door. The last he heard of them was Mary Trail's childlike voice calling back on a quavering note, "I shall never forget what you did, Mr. Blood. I shall never forget." But as it was not the voice he desired to hear, the assurance brought him little satisfaction. He stood there, in the dark, watching the fireflies amid the rhododendrons, till the hoof-beats had faded. Then he sighed and roused himself. He had much to do. His journey into town had not been one of idle curiosity to see how the Spaniards conducted themselves in victory. It had been inspired by a very different purpose, and he had gained in the course of it all the information he desired. He had an extremely busy night before him and must be moving. He went off briskly in the direction of the stockade, where his fellow slaves awaited him in deep anxiety and some hope. Chapter 9. The Rebel's Convict. There were, when the purple gloom of the tropical night descended upon the Caribbean, not more than 10 men on guard above the Cinco Llagos. So confident, and with good reason, were the Spaniards of the complete subjection of the islanders. And when I say that there were 10 men on guard, I state rather the purpose for which they were left aboard than the duty which they fulfilled. As a matter of fact, whilst the main body of the Spaniards feasted and rioted ashore, the Spanish gunner and his crew, who had so nobly done their duty and ensured the easy victory of the day, were feasting on the gun deck upon the wine and the fresh meats fetched out to them from shore. Above, 2 sentinels only kept vigil at stem and stern. Nor were they as vigilant as they should have been, or else they must have observed the 2 wherries that, under cover of the darkness, came gliding from the wharf with well-greased rowlocks to bring up in silence under the great ship's quarter. From the gallery aft still hung the ladder by which Don Diego had descended to the boat that had taken him ashore. The sentry, on guard in the stern, coming presently round this gallery, was suddenly confronted by the black shadow of a man standing before him at the head of the ladder. "Who's there?" he asked, but without alarm, supposing it was one of his fellows. "It is I," softly answered Peter Blood, in fluent Castilian, of which he was master. "Is it you, Pedro?" The Spaniard came a step nearer. "Peter is my name, but I doubt I'll not be the Peter you're expecting." "How?" quoth the sentry, checking. "This way," said Mr. Blood. The wooden taffrail was a low one, and the Spaniard was taken completely by surprise, save for the splash he made as he struck the water, narrowly missing one of the crowded boats that waited under the counter. Not a sound announced his misadventure. Armed as he was with corselet, cuissarts, and headpiece, he sank to trouble them no more. "Whist!" hissed Mr. Blood to his waiting rebels convict. "Come now, and without noise." Within 5 minutes they had swarmed aboard, the entire 20 of them overflowing from the narrow gallery and crouching on the quarter-deck itself. Lights showed ahead. Under the great lantern in the prow, they saw the black figure of another sentry, pacing on the forecastle. From below, sounds reached them of the orgy on the gun deck. A rich male voice was singing an obscene ballad, to which the others chanted in chorus. "Y estos son los usos de Castillo y de León." "From what I've seen today, I can well believe it," said Mr. Blood, and whispered, "Forward, after me." Crouching low, they glided noiseless as shadows to the quarter-deck rail, and thence slipped without sound down into the waist. 2/3 of them were armed with muskets, some of which they had found in the governor's house, and others supplied from the secret hoard that Mr. Blood had so laboriously assembled against the day of escape. The remainder were equipped with knives and cutlasses. In the vessel's waist they hung while Mr. Blood had satisfied himself that no other sentinel showed above decks, but that inconvenient fellow was in the prow. Their first attention must be for him. Mr. Blood himself crept forward with 2 companions. leaving the others in charge of that Nathaniel, leaving the others in charge of that Nathaniel Hagthorpe, whose sometime commission in the King's Navy gave him the best title to this office. Mr. Blood's absence was brief. When he rejoined his comrades, there was no watch above the Spaniards' decks. Meanwhile, the revelers below continued to make merry at their ease in the conviction of complete security. The garrison of Barbados was overpowered and disarmed, and their companions were ashore in complete possession of the town, glutting themselves hideously upon the fruits of victory. What, then, was there to fear? Even when their quarters were invaded and they found themselves surrounded by a score of wild, hairy, half-naked men who, save that they appeared once to have been white, looked like a horde of savages. The Spaniards could not believe their eyes. Who could have dreamed that a handful of forgotten plantation slaves would have dared to take so much upon themselves? The half-drunken Spaniards, their laughter suddenly quenched, the song perishing on their lips, stared, stricken and bewildered, at the leveled muskets by which they were checkmated. And then from out of this uncouth pack of savages that beset them stepped a slim, tall fellow, with light blue eyes in a tawny face, eyes in which glinted the light of a wicked humor. He addressed them in the purest Castilian. You will have yourselves pain and trouble by regarding yourselves as my prisoner and suffering yourselves to be quietly bestowed out of harm's way. Name of God, swore the gunner, which did no justice at all to an amazement beyond expression. If you please, said Mr. Blood, and thereupon these gentlemen of Spain were induced, without further trouble, beyond a musket prod or two, to drop through a scuttle to the deck below. After that, the rebels-convict refreshed themselves with the good things in the consumption of which they had interrupted the Spaniards. To taste palatable Christian food after months of salt fish and maize dumplings was in itself a feast to these unfortunates. But there were no excesses Mr. Blood saw to that, although it required all the firmness of which he was capable. Dispositions were to be made without delay against that which must follow after they could abandon themselves fully to the enjoyment of their victory. Although it was one that afforded them the key to the situation, it remained to dispose so that the utmost profit might be drawn from it. Those dispositions occupied some very considerable portion of the night, but at least they were complete before the sun peeped over the shoulder of Mount Hilbay to shed his light upon a day of some surprises. It was soon after sunrise that the rebel convict, who paced the quarter-deck in Spanish corselet and headpiece, a Spanish musket on his shoulder, announced the approach of a boat. It was Don Diego de Espinosa y Valdez, coming aboard with 4 great treasure chests containing each 25,000 pieces of 8, the ransom delivered to him at dawn by Governor Steed. He was accompanied by his son, Don Esteban, and by 6 men who took the oars. Aboard the frigate all was quiet and orderly, as it should be. She rode at anchor, her larboard to the shore, and the main ladder on her starboard side. Round to this came the boat with Don Diego and his treasure. Mr. Blood had disposed effectively. It was not for nothing that he had served under de Ruyter. The swings were waiting, and the windlass manned. Below, a gun crew held itself in readiness under the command of Ogle, who, as I have said, had been a gunner in the Royal Navy before he went in for politics and followed the fortunes of the Duke of Monmouth. He was a sturdy, resolute fellow who inspired confidence by the very confidence he displayed in himself. Don Diego mounted the ladder and stepped upon the deck, alone and entirely unsuspicious. What should the poor man suspect? Before he could even look around and survey, his guard drawn up to receive him, a tap over the head with a capstan bar, effectively handled by Hagthorpe, put him to sleep without the least fuss. He was carried away to his cabin, whilst the treasure chests, handled by the men he had left in the boat, were being hauled to the deck. That being satisfactorily accomplished, Don Esteban and the fellows who had manned the boat came up the ladder, one by one, to be handled with the same great efficiency. Peter Blood had a genius for these things, and almost, I suspect, an eye for the dramatic. Dramatic certainly was the spectacle now offered to the survivors of the raid. With Colonel Bishop at their head, and gout-ridden Governor Steed sitting on the ruins of a wall beside him, they glumly watched the departure of the 8 boats containing the weary Spanish ruffians who had glutted themselves with rapine murder and violences unspeakable. They looked on, between relief at this departure of their remorseless enemies, and despair at the wild ravages which, temporarily at least, had wrecked the prosperity and happiness of that little colony. The boats pulled away from the shore, and with their loads of laughing, jeering Spaniards, who were still flinging taunts across the water at their surviving victims. They had come midway between the wharf and the ship when suddenly the air was shaken by the boom of a gun. A round shot struck the water within a fathom of the foremost boat, sending a shower of spray over its occupants. They paused at their oars, astounded into silence for a moment. Then speech burst from them like an explosion. Angrily voluble, they anathematized this dangerous carelessness on the part of their gunner, who should know better than to fire a salute from a cannon loaded with shot. They were still cursing him when a second shot, better aimed than the first, came to crumple one of the boats into splinters, flinging its crew, dead and living, into the water. But if it silenced these, it gave tongue, still more angry, vehement, and bewildered, to the crews of the other 7 boats, from which the suspended oars stood out poised over the water, whilst on their feet, in the excitement, the Spaniards screamed oaths at the ship, begging heaven and hell to inform them what madmen had been let loose among her guns. Plump into their middle came a third shot, smashing a second boat with fearful execution, followed again by a moment of awful silence. Then, among those Spanish pirates, all was gibbering and jabbering and splashing of oars as they attempted to pull in every direction at once. Some were for going ashore, others for heading straight to the vessel and there discovering what might be amiss. That something was very gravely amiss, there could be no further doubt, particularly whilst they discussed and fumed and cursed, 2 more shots came over the water to account for yet a third of their boats. The resolute Ogle was making excellent practice and fully justifying his claims to know something of gunnery. In their consternation, the Spaniards had simplified his task by huddling their boats together. After the 4th shot, opinion was no longer divided amongst them. As with one accord they went about, or attempted to do so, for before they had accomplished it, 2 more of their boats had been sunk. The 3 boats that remained, without concerning themselves with their more unfortunate fellows, who were struggling in the water, headed back for the wharf at speed. If the Spaniards understood nothing of all this, the forlorn islanders ashore understood still less, until, to help their wits, they saw the flag of Spain come down from the mainmast of the Cinco Llagos, and the flag of England soar to its empty place. Even then some bewilderment persisted, and it was with fearful eyes that they observed the return of their enemies, who might vent upon them the ferocity aroused by these extraordinary events. Ogle, however, continued to give proof that his knowledge of gunnery was not of yesterday. After the fleeing Spaniards went his shots, the last of their boats flew into splinters as it touched the wharf, and its remains were buried under a shower of loosened masonry. That was the end of this pirate crew, which not 10 minutes ago had been laughingly counting up the pieces of 8 that would fall to the portion of each for his share in the act of villainy. Close upon 60 survivors continued to reach the shore, whereupon they had cause for congratulations. I am unable to say, in the absence of any records, in which their fate may be traced. That lack of records is in itself eloquent. We know that they were made fast as they landed, and considering the offense they had given, I am not disposed to doubt that they had every reason to regret the survival. The mystery of the succor that had come at the 11th hour to wreak vengeance upon the Spaniards and to preserve for the island the extortionate ransom of 100,000 pieces of 8 remained yet to be probed. That the Cinco Llagos was now in friendly hands could no longer be doubted after the proofs it had given. But who, the people of Bridgetown asked one another, were the men in possession of her, and whence had they come? The only possible assumption ran the truth very closely. A resolute party of islanders must have got aboard during the night and seized the ship. It remained to ascertain the precise identity of these mysterious saviors and do them fitting honor. Upon this errand, Governor Steed's condition not permitting him to go in person, went Colonel Bishop, as the governor's deputy, attended by 2 officers. As he stepped from the ladder into the vessel's waist, the colonel beheld there, beside the main hatch, the 4 treasure chests, the contents of one of which had been contributed almost entirely by himself. It was a gladsome spectacle, and his eyes sparkled in beholding it. Ranged on the other side, athwart the deck, stood a score of men in 2 well-ordered files, with breasts and backs of steel, polished Spanish morions on their heads overshadowing their faces, and muskets ordered at their sides. Colonel Bishop could not be expected to recognize at a glance in these upright, furbished, soldierly figures the ragged, unkempt scarecrows that but yesterday had been toiling in his plantations. Still less could he have expected to recognize at once the courtly gentleman who advanced to greet him, a lean, graceful gentleman, dressed in the Spanish fashion, all in black, with a silver lace and gold-hilted sword dangling beside him from a gold-embroidered baldric. A broad castor with a sweeping plume set above carefully curled ringlets of deepest black. "Welcome aboard the Cinco Llagos, Colonel Darling," a voice vaguely familiar addressed the planter. "We've made the best of the Spaniard's wardrobe in honor of this visit, though it was scarcely yourself we had dared hope to expect. You find yourself among friends, old friends of yours, all." The colonel stared in stupefaction. Mr. Blood, tricked out in all his splendor, indulging therein his natural taste. His face carefully shaven, his hair as carefully dressed, seemed transformed into a younger man. The fact is, he looked no more like the 33 years he counted to his age. "Peter Blood!" It was an ejaculation of amazement. Satisfaction followed swiftly. "Was it you, then?" "Myself it was, myself, and these, my good friends, and yours." Mr. Blood tossed back the fine lace from his wrist to wave a hand toward the file of men standing to attention there. The colonel looked more closely. "Gad's my life!" he crowed on a note of foolish jubilation. "And it was these fellows that you took the Spaniards and turned the tables on these dogs? Odds wounds, it was heroic." "Heroic, was it? Bedad, it's epic. You begin to perceive breadth and depth of my genius." Colonel Bishop sat himself down on the hatch combing and took off his broad hat and mopped his brow. "You amaze me," he gasped. "On my soul, you amaze me. To have recovered the treasure and to have seized this fine ship and all she'll hold, it'll be something to set against the other losses we have suffered. As Gad's my life, you deserve well for this." "I am entirely of your opinion." "Damn, you deserve well, and damn you shall find me grateful." "That's as it should be," said Mr. Blood. "The question is, how well we deserve, and how grateful shall we find you?" Colonel Bishop considered him. There was a shadow of surprise on his face. "Why, His Excellency shall write home on account of your exploit, and maybe some portion of your sentences shall be remitted." "The generosity of King James is well known," sneered Nathaniel Hagthorpe, who was standing by, and amongst the ranged rebels convicts someone ventured to laugh. Colonel Bishop started up. He was pervaded by the first pang of uneasiness. It occurred to him that all here might not be as friendly as appeared. "And there's another matter," Mr. Blood resumed. "There's a matter of a flogging that's due to me. Ye are a man of your word in such matters, Colonel, if not perhaps in others. And ye said, I think, that ye'd not leave a square inch of skin on my back." The planter waved the matter aside. Almost it seemed to offend him. "Tush, tush! After this splendid deed of yours, do you suppose I could be thinking of such things?" "I'm glad you feel like that about it. But I'm thinking it's mighty lucky for me the Spaniards didn't come today instead of yesterday, or it's in the same plight as Jeremy Pitt I'd be in this minute. And in that case, there was the genius that would have turned the tables on these rascally Spaniards." "Why speak of it now?" "I must, Colonel Darling. We've worked a deal of wickedness and cruelty in your time, and I want this to be a lesson to you, a lesson that you'll remember for the sake of others who may come after us. There's Jeremy up there in the roundhouse, with a back that's every color of the rainbow, and the poor lad'll not be himself again for a month. And if it hadn't been for the Spaniards, maybe it's dead he'd be by now, and maybe myself with him." Hagthorpe lounged forward. He was a fairly tall, vigorous man with a clear-cut, attractive face, which in itself announced his breeding. "Why will you be wasting words on the hog?" wondered that sometime officer of the Royal Navy. "Fling him overboard and have done with him." The colonel's eyes bulged in his head. "What the devil do you mean?" he blustered. It's the lucky man ye are entirely, Colonel, though you don't guess the source of your good fortune." And now another intervened, the brawny, one-eyed Wolverstone, less mercifully disposed than his more gentlemanly fellows convict. "String him up by the yard-arm!" he cried, his deep voice harsh and angry, and more than one of the slaves standing to their arms made echo. Colonel Bishop trembled. Mr. Blood turned. He was quite calm. "If you please, Wolverstone," said he, "I will conduct affairs in my own way. That is the pact. You'll please to remember it." His eyes looked along the ranks, making it plain that he addressed them all. "I desire that Colonel Bishop should have his life. One reason is that I require him as a hostage. If ye insist on hanging him, you'll have to hang me with him, or, in the alternative, I'll go ashore." He paused. There was no answer. But they stood hang-dog and half-mutinous before him, save Hagthorpe, who shrugged and smiled wearily. Mr. Blood resumed. "You'll please to understand that aboard a ship there is one captain. So." He swung again to the startled colonel. "Though I promise you your life, I must, as you've heard, keep you aboard as a hostage for the good behavior of Governor Steed, and what's left of the fort until we can put to sea." "Until you—" Horror prevented Colonel Bishop from echoing the remainder of that incredible speech. "Just so," said Peter Blood, as he turned to the officers who had accompanied the colonel. "The boat is waiting, gentlemen. You'll have heard what I said. Convey it with my compliments to His Excellency." "But, sir," one of them began. "There is no more to be said, gentlemen. My name is Blood. Captain Blood, if you please, of this ship, the Cinco Llagos, taken as a prize of war from Don Diego de Espinosa y Valdez, who is my prisoner aboard. You are to understand that I have turned the tables on more than the Spaniards. There's the ladder. You'll find it more convenient than being heaved over the side, which is what'll happen if you linger." They went, though not without some hustling, regardless of the bellowings of Colonel Bishop, whose monstrous rage was fanned by terror at finding himself at the mercy of these men of whose cause to hate him he was very fully conscious. A half-dozen of them, apart from Jeremy Pitt, who was utterly incapacitated for the present, possessed a superficial knowledge of seamanship. Hagthorpe, although he had been a fighting officer untrained in navigation, knew how to handle a ship, and under his directions they set about getting under way. The anchor catted, and the mainsail unfurled. They stood out for the open before a gentle breeze, without interference from the fort. As they were running close to the headland east of the bay, Peter Blood returned to the colonel, who, under guard and panic-stricken, had dejectedly resumed his seat on the coamings of the main hatch. "Can you swim, Colonel?" Colonel Bishop looked up. His great face was yellow and seemed, in that moment of a preternatural flabbiness, his beady eyes were beadier than ever. "As your doctor now, I prescribe a swim, to cool the excessive heat of your humors." Blood delivered the explanation pleasantly, and receiving still no answer from the colonel, continued. "It's a mercy for you I'm not by nature as bloodthirsty as some of my friends here, and it's the devil's own labor I've had to prevail upon them not to be vindictive. I doubt if you're worth the pains I've taken for you." He was lying. He had no doubt at all. He had followed his own wishes and instincts. He would certainly have strung the colonel up and accounted it a meritorious deed. It was the thought of Arabella Bishop that had urged him to mercy, and had led him to oppose the natural vindictiveness of his fellow slaves, until he had been in danger of precipitating a mutiny. It was entirely to the fact that the colonel was her uncle, although he did not even begin to suspect such a cause, that he owed such mercy as was now being shown him. "You shall have a chance to swim for it," Peter Blood continued. "It's not above a quarter of a mile to the headland yonder, and with ordinary luck you should manage it. Faith, you're fat enough to float. Come on. Now, don't be hesitating, or it'll be a long voyage you'll be going with us, and the devil knows what may happen to you. You're not loved any more than you deserve." Colonel Bishop mastered himself and rose. A merciless despot who had never known the need for restraint in all these years. He was doomed by ironic fate to practice restraint in the very moment when his feelings had reached their most violent intensity. Peter Blood gave an order. A plank was run out over the gunwale and lashed down. "If you please, Colonel," said he, with a graceful flourish of invitation. The colonel looked at him, and there was hell in his glance. Then, taking his resolve and putting the best face upon it, since no other could help him here, he kicked off his shoes, peeled off his fine coat of biscuit-colored taffetas, and climbed upon the plank. A moment he paused, steadied by a hand that clutched the ratlines, looking down in terror at the green water rushing past some 25 feet below. "Just take a little walk, Colonel Darling," said a smooth, mocking voice behind him. Still clinging, Colonel Bishop looked round in hesitation and saw the bulwarks lined with swarthy faces, the faces of men that, as lately as yesterday, would have turned pale under his frown, faces that were now all wickedly agrin. For a moment rage stamped out his fear. He cursed them aloud vehemently and incoherently, then loosed his hold and stepped out upon the plank. 3 steps he took before he lost his balance and went tumbling into the green depths below. When he came to the surface again, gasping for air, the Cinco Llagas was already some furlongs to leeward. But the roaring cheer of mocking valediction from the rebel's convict reached him across the water to drive the iron of impotent rage deeper into his soul. And that, my friends, concludes Chapter 9 of Captain Blood. Now, in this chapter, finally named Captain Blood. So, thank you very much for joining me today. Do join me again on Friday at 4 p.m. as we read Chapter 10 of Captain Blood. Oh, it's getting good now, isn't it? I can't wait to read more, and I hope you can join me for that. Otherwise, take care, everyone. We'll see you again. Bye now.